When Magdalena Rose's wagon was shattered on the endless Nebraska prairie in 1867, she never imagined that 3 days of sleeping beneath the wreckage would lead to the most important decision of her life. A silent mountain man with scarred hands and haunted eyes appeared from nowhere, whispering words that would change everything. But would she have the courage to abandon everything she thought she wanted for a love she never saw coming? The broken wagon will spun lazily in the hot Nebraska wind, making a clicking sound that drove Magdalena Rose nearly mad. She pressed her palms against her ears, but the noise followed her into the shade beneath the tilted wagon where she'd been hiding for 3 long days. Her pretty white wedding dress was now the color of prairie dirt. The silk fabric that once made her feel like a real lady now scratched against her sunburned skin. She pulled her knees to her chest and tried not to think about how thirsty she was. The prairie stretched out forever in every direction. No trees, no houses, no people, just endless grass that whispered secrets she couldn't understand. Sometimes she heard voices calling her name, but when she crawled out to look, nothing was there except more emptiness. Marcus should have come back by now. Her husband-to-be had promised to return within 2 weeks after he rode ahead to claim their land. But that was 3 weeks ago, before her wagon broke down in the middle of nowhere. Before her 2 oxen wandered off into the night, their bells growing quieter and quieter until silence swallowed everything. She tried to fix the wheel herself on that first day. Her hands were soft from her city life in Boston, not used to heavy work. The wood was harder than she expected. The metal pieces didn't fit together the way they should. After hours of struggling, she'd given up and crawled under the wagon to escape the burning sun. Now her water jug was empty. The last of her bread had gone stale yesterday. Her stomach felt like it was eating itself from the inside. But the worst part wasn't the hunger or thirst. It was the terrible quiet that pressed down on her like a heavy blanket. Back in Boston, she'd worked in Mrs. Patterson's dress shop. Every day brought customers with their chatter and complaints and gossip. The street outside stayed busy with horses and carriages and people going about their lives. She'd never realized how much she needed those sounds until they were gone. Marcus had written such beautiful letters. He'd promised her a real home with a garden and maybe chickens. He'd said she'd never want for anything once they were married. His words had painted pictures of a life so different from her tiny room above the dress shop, where she'd lived alone since her parents died of fever. "Come west with me, my dear Magdalena," his last letter had said. "I'll make you the happiest woman in the territory." She'd sold everything she owned to buy the wagon and supplies. The other women at the shop had called her brave. Some had called her foolish. Now, lying in the dirt with her stomach cramping from emptiness, she wondered if they'd been right. A meadowlark sang somewhere in the distance. The sound was pretty but lonely. Like everything else out here, it reminded her how small she was in this big, empty world. She closed her eyes and tried to remember what Marcus looked like. Brown hair, she thought. Nice teeth. Clean hands that had never done hard work. But his face was getting fuzzy in her memory, like looking through dirty glass. The sun was getting lower, turning the sky orange and pink. Soon it would be dark again, and she'd have to listen to the coyotes howling. Last night they'd sounded closer than before. She'd gripped the old rifle Marcus had left with her, even though she'd never shot anything in her life. Her mouth was so dry now that swallowing hurt. She'd tried chewing grass like she'd seen the oxen do, but it only made her feel sick. There had to be water somewhere. Rivers and streams crossed the prairie, didn't they? But which direction should she walk? And what if she got lost and couldn't find her way back to the wagon? At least the wagon was something. It was broken and useless, but it was shelter. It was the only thing between her and the endless sky that seemed to go on forever. A hawk circled high above, riding the wind currents with its wings spread wide. She envied its freedom, its ability to see the whole world spread out below. From up there, maybe this prairie looked different. Maybe it looked like home to something. She pulled Marcus's last letter from her pocket. The paper was wrinkled and stained now, but she could still read his careful handwriting. "Wait for me at Chimney Rock if your wagon breaks down," it said. "I'll find you there." But Chimney Rock was still 2 days ahead, and her wagon was never going to move again. She was stuck here, getting weaker by the hour, while somewhere out there Marcus was probably wondering why she hadn't arrived at their meeting place. The clicking of the broken wheel stopped suddenly. In the new quiet, she heard something else. Something that made her heart jump with hope and fear at the same time. Hoofbeats. From his spot on the ridge, Ezra Thornfield watched the woman through his looking glass. She'd been down there for 3 days now, and he'd been watching her for just as long. He told himself he was just curious. Nothing more. But curiosity didn't explain why his chest felt tight when she stopped moving for hours at a time. Or why he'd caught himself riding closer each day, even though getting involved with people always led to trouble. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Buck, stamped his feet and snorted. The animal was smarter than most people Ezra knew. Buck could sense when something was wrong, and right now everything about the situation felt wrong. The woman hadn't moved since morning. Yesterday she'd crawled around the wagon, searching for something. Water, probably. Or food. Today she just lay there like a broken doll someone had thrown away. Ezra lowered the looking glass and rubbed his scarred left hand. The twisted skin still hurt when storms were coming, and the way the clouds were building to the west told him they were in for a rough night. That woman wouldn't survive another storm in her condition. He'd been living alone in the Black Hills for 5 years now. 5 years since the fire. 5 years since Catherine died trying to save their barn while he was away hunting. 5 years of talking to nobody but his horse and the mountains. People brought pain. That was a fact he'd learned the hard way. Better to stay away from them, to live quiet and hurt nobody. But watching someone die when you could help them was different. Catherine would have boxed his ears for even thinking about riding away. She'd always said that decent folks helped each other, no matter what. "What do you think, Buck?" he asked the horse. "Should we mind our own business?" Buck turned his head and looked at him with those dark, knowing eyes. Sometimes Ezra swore the animal could read his thoughts. Down below, a group of vultures had started circling. That decided it. Ezra packed his looking glass and checked his supplies. He had extra water, some dried meat, and hardtack that would keep a person alive even if it tasted like sawdust. He'd brought plenty because he'd planned to be out here for another week, checking his trap lines and enjoying the peace. So much for peace. The ride down the slope took longer than he'd expected. The ground was rocky and uneven, full of holes that could break a horse's leg if you weren't careful. Buck picked his way down slowly, sure-footed as always. As they got closer, Ezra could see the wagon more clearly. One wheel was completely broken. The wooden spokes snapped like kindling. The canvas cover was torn and flapping in the wind. Boxes and barrels were scattered around like someone had dumped them in a hurry. But it was the woman that made him urge Buck to move faster. She was lying too still, and her skin looked pale as winter snow. Her fancy dress was ruined, torn and stained with dirt, and what looked like blood from scratches on her arms. She was young, maybe 25 or so. Pretty, even with her brown hair tangled and her face streaked with dust. But what struck him most was how small she looked. How lost. Ezra dismounted and approached slowly. He'd learned long ago that scared people could be dangerous, especially when they had nothing left to lose. The rifle lying beside her was old but clean. She'd know how to use it if she had to. "Ma'am," he said quietly, not wanting to startle her. Her eyes opened slowly, like she was having trouble focusing. They were green, he noticed. Green like new leaves in spring. "You're real," she whispered. Her voice was rough from thirst, barely more than a breath. He nodded and pulled his water skin from Buck's saddle. "Drink slow," he said, kneeling beside her. "Too much at once will make you sick." She drank carefully, her hands shaking as she held the leather container. He could see her forcing herself to take small sips even though she probably wanted to gulp it all down. While she drank, Ezra looked around at the wreckage. This had been a good wagon once, built strong for the long journey west. The woman had packed carefully too. He could see dishes wrapped in cloth, books tied with string, even a small mirror packed in sawdust. Someone had been planning a real life out here. Someone had dreams. "Can't fix this," he said, looking at the broken wheel. The hub was cracked clean through, and 3 spokes were snapped. Even if he had the tools, which he didn't, it would take days of work. She nodded like she'd already figured that out. I tried, she said. I'm not very good with tools. Takes practice, he said. Where were you headed? Chimney Rock. My husband-to-be is waiting for me there. She said it like she was trying to convince herself it was true. Ezra had been to Chimney Rock. It was 2 days hard ride from here, longer if you were walking. This woman wouldn't make it half a mile in her condition. How long since you've eaten? He asked. 2 days. Maybe 3. The days run together out here. He pulled some dried meat from his pack and handed it to her. Chew it slow. Your stomach's not ready for much. As she ate, he studied her face. There was something about her that reminded him of Catherine. Not the way she looked, but the way she held herself. Like she was trying to be brave even when everything was falling apart. What's your name? He asked. Magdalena Rose. She paused. What's yours? He almost didn't answer. Names made things personal, and personal meant getting involved. But she was looking at him with those green eyes, waiting. Ezra Thornfield. She smiled for the first time since he'd arrived. It was a small smile, weak but real. Thank you, Mr. Thornfield. For the water and food. For stopping. He stood up and looked west, where the storm clouds were getting darker. Storm's coming, he said. This wagon won't protect you from what's building out there. Her smile faded. I can't leave. Marcus said to wait at Chimney Rock if something happened. He'll come looking for me. Ezra didn't say what he was thinking. That any man worth marrying would have come back to check on her by now. That 3 weeks was too long to leave someone alone on the prairie. That sometimes the people who made promises were the first ones to break them. Instead, he said, storm like this one can kill you. Lightning, hail big as eggs, wind that'll pick up a wagon and throw it a mile. She looked at the approaching clouds, then back at him. He could see her thinking, trying to decide what was more dangerous, staying here or trusting a stranger. Finally, she asked the question he'd been dreading. Where would we go? I have a cabin in the Black Hills, Ezra said, his voice barely louder than the wind. It's not much, but the roof doesn't leak. Magdalena stared at him, her mind racing. Going with a stranger felt dangerous, but staying here felt like dying slowly. The storm clouds were getting closer, and she could already feel the electricity in the air making her skin tingle. How far? She asked. 2 days' ride if we push hard. 3 if we take it easy. He looked at her torn dress and scratched arms. Might be better to take it easy. She tried to stand up, but her legs felt like water. 3 days without proper food had left her weaker than she'd realized. Ezra caught her arm as she swayed, his grip gentle but steady. I can't ride a horse, she admitted. I never learned how. Buck's gentle. He'll take care of you. Ezra's scarred hand patted the horse's neck. Been carrying folks for years. Thunder rumbled in the distance, still far off but getting closer. Magdalena looked back at her broken wagon. Everything she owned was scattered around it, her books, her dishes, the quilt her mother had made. How could she just leave it all behind? My things, she said. Take what you can carry. Rest will have to stay. She gathered her few precious items. The small Bible her father had given her, a daguerreotype of her parents, and the letters from Marcus. Everything else. The fancy dishes she'd bought for her new home, the expensive fabric for curtains, would have to stay for the prairie wind to claim. Ezra helped her pack the items in his saddlebags. His hands were careful with her things, treating them like they mattered. She noticed again how badly scarred his left hand was. The skin looked melted, twisted into shapes that must have caused terrible pain. What happened to your hand? She asked, then immediately felt her face go red. I'm sorry. That was rude. Fire, he said simply. Long time ago. He didn't offer more details, but she could see the shadow that crossed his face. Some hurts were too big for words. The first drops of rain started falling as Ezra helped her onto Buck's back. The horse was bigger than she'd expected, and sitting so high up made her dizzy. But Buck stood perfectly still while she found her balance, like he understood she was scared. Hold on to the saddle horn, Ezra said. swinging up behind her. "I won't let you fall." Having him so close felt strange. She could smell soap and leather and something else, would smoke, maybe. It was nothing like Marcus's fancy cologne, but it made her feel safer somehow. They rode away from the wagon just as the storm hit in earnest. Rain came down in sheets, soaking through her dress in seconds. Lightning split the sky so close she could taste metal in the air. But Buck kept moving steadily forward, and Ezra's arms around her kept her from sliding off. "There's a cave up ahead," Ezra shouted over the thunder. "We can wait it out there." The cave was small but dry. Ezra built a fire near the entrance while Magdalena huddled against the back wall, shivering in her wet clothes. The flames cast dancing shadows on the stone walls, making the space feel almost cozy. "Here." Ezra handed her a dry shirt from his pack. "Turn around. I'll keep watch." She changed quickly, grateful for the warmth of the clean cotton. The shirt was too big, but it was dry and smelled like sunshine. When she turned back around, Ezra was staring into the fire like he could see pictures in the flames. "Tell me about your cabin," she said. "What's it like?" "Small. One room with a loft for sleeping. There's a garden out back, but it's gone wild now." His voice got quiet. "Catherine used to tend it. She had a way with growing things." "Catherine? My wife. She died 5 years ago." He poked at the fire with a stick. "Haven't had much use for gardens since then." Magdalena heard the pain in his voice and wanted to comfort him somehow. But she barely knew him. What right did she have to pry into his grief? "I'm sorry," she said instead. "She would have liked you," Ezra said suddenly. "Catherine always said the best people were the ones who kept going even when things got hard." The storm raged outside the cave, but inside it felt peaceful, safe. Magdalena found herself relaxing for the first time in days. The fire was warm, her stomach was full of Ezra's dried meat, and she wasn't alone anymore. "Why did you help me?" she asked. "You could have just ridden away." Ezra was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, like he was choosing each one carefully. "Because I know what it's like to be left behind," he said. "I know what it feels like when the people who are supposed to care about you just don't." Something in his tone made her look at him more closely. There was old hurt in his eyes, the kind that never really healed. "Marcus didn't abandon me," she said, but the words sounded hollow even to her. "He's probably looking for me right now." "Maybe," Ezra said, "but even if he is, you still deserve better than being left alone on the prairie for 3 weeks. His words hit her like a physical blow. She'd been making excuses for Marcus, telling herself he must have good reasons for not coming back. But deep down, she'd started to wonder if he'd simply changed his mind about marrying her. "I sold everything to come west," she whispered. "My job, my room, everything. I don't have anything to go back to." "Then maybe it's time to build something new." The fire crackled between them, filling the silence with its own conversation. Outside, the storm was starting to weaken. Soon they'd have to leave the safe cave and continue their journey into the unknown. But for now, Magdalena let herself imagine what it would be like to have a real home. Not the fantasy Marcus had painted in his letters, but something honest and simple. A place where she could tend a garden and watch the seasons change. A place where she belonged. "How much farther to your cabin?" she asked. "We should reach it by tomorrow evening if the weather holds." Ezra banked the fire for the night. "You should get some sleep. Tomorrow will be a long day." As she settled down on the cave floor, using Ezra's spare blanket as a pillow, Magdalena found herself thinking about choices. For the first time in her life, she was making decisions based on what felt right instead of what was expected. It was terrifying and thrilling at the same time. The storm moved on, leaving the night quiet except for the occasional drip of water from the cave entrance. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called out, and another answered. Even the wild creatures had companions. Maybe she didn't have to be alone after all. The morning sun painted the prairie in shades of gold and green that took Magdalena's breath away. After 3 days under the broken wagon, she'd forgotten how beautiful the world could be. Every blade of grass sparkled with leftover raindrops, and the air smelled clean and fresh. But her body reminded her quickly that beauty didn't make the journey easier. Her legs ached from gripping Buck's sides, and her back felt like someone had twisted it into knots. Riding a horse was harder work than she'd imagined. "We'll stop soon," Ezra said, as if he could read her discomfort. "Buck needs water, and you need to stretch." They'd been riding since dawn, and the landscape was slowly changing. The flat prairie was giving way to rolling hills dotted with trees. In the distance, Magdalena could see the dark outline of mountains rising like sleeping giants. "Are those the Black Hills?" she asked. "The edge of them. We'll be climbing into them this afternoon." She tried to imagine what his cabin would look like. In her mind, she pictured something small and cozy, with windows that looked out on the mountains. Maybe there would be wildflowers growing near the door, and a stream where she could wash her face. But then she remembered that this was only temporary. Once Marcus found her, she'd have to leave. The thought made her stomach twist in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. They stopped beside a creek that bubbled over smooth stones. Ezra helped her down from Buck, and she had to grab onto his arm to keep from falling. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else. "Walk around a bit," he advised. "Get the blood moving." While she stretched her sore muscles, Ezra led Buck to the water. The horse drank deeply, his ears flicking back and forth as he listened to the sounds around them. Magdalena envied how alert he was, how at home he seemed in this wild place. "I used to think the prairie was empty," she said, watching a hawk circle overhead. "But there's so much life here. Most folks don't take time to notice." Ezra filled his water bottles from the creek. "They're too busy trying to get somewhere else. Like me. Like all of us, I suppose." He looked at her with those storm-gray eyes. "Question is, are you running towards something or away from something?" The question caught her off guard. She thought she was running toward Marcus, toward marriage and security. But maybe she'd really been running away from loneliness. From the empty room above the dress shop where she'd had no one to talk to but herself. "I don't know," she admitted. "Well, you've got time to figure it out." They mounted up again and continued their journey into the hills. The path was steeper now, winding between pine trees that seemed to touch the sky. The air grew cooler and thinner, making Magdalena feel lightheaded. "How much farther?" she asked. "Another hour, maybe 2. Ezra guided Buck around a fallen log. "Depends on how many detours we have to make." "Detours? Sometimes the trail gets washed out. Sometimes there's a bear using it." He said it so casually that it took her a moment to realize he was serious. "Bears? Black bears mostly. They're more scared of you than you are of them. Usually. That wasn't as comforting as he probably meant it to be. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, with only the sound of Buck's hooves on the rocky path and the whisper of wind through the pines. Magdalena found herself relaxing despite her worries. There was something peaceful about these mountains, something that made her feel small but not unimportant. "Ezra," she said suddenly, "can I ask you something?" "Sure. Do you ever get lonely? Living by yourself, I mean." He was quiet for so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "Every day. But being alone isn't the same as being lonely. I learned that after Catherine died." "What do you mean?" "Being alone is a choice. Being lonely is something that happens to you whether you want it or not." He shifted in the saddle behind her. "I chose to be alone because it hurt less than being around people who reminded me of what I'd lost. But now you're helping me. Now I'm remembering that some things are worth the risk." His words sent a warm feeling through her chest, but she pushed it away. She was engaged to Marcus. She had no business feeling warm about another man's words. But Marcus hadn't come back for her. He'd left her alone on the prairie while he conducted his business. What kind of man did that to someone he claimed to love? "There," Ezra said, pointing ahead. "Home." The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by aspen trees, their leaves already starting to turn yellow with the coming autumn. It was bigger than she'd expected, built from logs that had weathered to a soft gray. Smoke curled from the chimney, and there were flowers blooming in what had once been a garden. "It's beautiful," she breathed. Catherine's touch, he said. I just kept it from falling down. As they approached, Magdalena could see the details that spoke of a woman's presence. Curtains in the windows, even though they were faded now. A wind chime made from pieces of colored glass hanging from the porch. Herbs growing wild near the kitchen door. Ezra helped her down from Buck, and she stood for a moment just looking at the place. Felt like a real home, not just a house. Felt like somewhere you could belong. Come on, Ezra said. Let me show you inside. The cabin was simple but comfortable. One main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area with a pump for water, and a loft reached by a wooden ladder. Everything was clean and well-maintained, but Magdalena could see the emptiness in it, the absence of life. You can sleep in the loft, Ezra said. I'll take the couch down here. I don't want to put you out of your own bed. You're not. Haven't slept up there since. He didn't finish the sentence, but she understood. Since Catherine died. There are clothes in the chest, he continued. Catherine's things. You're welcome to them if you want. The idea of wearing a dead woman's clothes felt strange, but her own dress was beyond saving. And something about the way Ezra said it made her think Catherine would have wanted her things to be useful again. Thank you, she said, for everything. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. No need. Sometimes helping someone else is the only way to help yourself. He went outside to tend to Buck, leaving Magdalena alone in the cabin. She climbed the ladder to the loft and found herself in what had clearly been a couple's bedroom. A double bed with a wedding ring quilt. A dresser with a mirror and brush set. A window that looked out over the mountains. It was beautiful and sad at the same time. She could imagine Catherine here, brushing her hair at the mirror, looking out at the view. She could imagine Ezra watching her, happy in a way he clearly wasn't anymore. In the chest, she found simple dresses in blues and greens, all carefully folded and smelling of lavender. They were practical clothes, made for a woman who worked with her hands and didn't have time for fancy frills. Magdalena held up a blue dress that looked like it might fit. As she did, she caught sight of herself in the mirror. Her hair was tangled, her face was sunburned, and her eyes looked different somehow. Older, more serious. 3 days ago, she'd been a shop girl from Boston, waiting for her husband-to-be to make all her dreams come true. Now she was standing in a dead woman's bedroom, wearing a stranger's clothes, in a place so far from civilization that she might never find her way back. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure she wanted to. 3 weeks passed like a pleasant dream, and Magdalena found herself forgetting to watch the trail for Marcus's arrival. She was kneeling in Catherine's garden, pulling weeds from around the tomato plants, when she heard the hoofbeats that would change everything. The sound made her heart jump in a way she didn't expect. Not with joy, but with something closer to dread. She wiped her dirt-covered hands on the apron she'd found in Catherine's things and stood slowly, watching a rider emerge from the tree line. Marcus Holloway looked exactly as she remembered him. Tall and handsome, with perfectly combed hair and clothes that stayed clean even after days of travel. His horse was expensive too, a glossy black mare that probably cost more than most people made in a year. But seeing him now, after weeks in this simple mountain home, Magdalena noticed things that memory had hidden. The way his eyes swept over everything like he was putting a price on it. The slight frown that creased his face when he saw her simple dress and sun-darkened skin. Magdalena! His voice carried relief mixed with something that sounded like displeasure. Thank God I found you. When your wagon wasn't at Chimney Rock, I feared the worst. The wheel broke, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Mr. Thornfield helped me. As if summoned by his name, Ezra appeared from the woods carrying an armload of split firewood. He moved with the quiet confidence she'd grown used to, but she could see the tension in his shoulders as he took in the scene. The two men looked at each other across the clearing, and Magdalena felt the air grow thick with unspoken challenges. Marcus sat tall in his saddle, everything about him announcing his claim on her. Ezra stood with his feet planted firmly on his own land, the scars on his hands catching the afternoon light. Mr. Holloway, Ezra said with a slight nod. Sir. Marcus's voice was cold as winter wind. I've come for my bride. The word bride hung between them like a line drawn in the dirt. Magdalena felt something inside her rebel against being discussed like property to be collected. Perhaps you should ask the lady what she wants, Ezra said quietly. Marcus's face darkened. I know what she wants. We have an agreement. Plans. A future together. Plans can change, Ezra replied. Futures too. Not these plans. Marcus dismounted and walked toward Magdalena with the confident stride of a man who'd never been refused anything. My dear, gather your things. We have a long ride ahead of us, and I've already lost too much time searching for you. Something in his tone made her take a step backward. In his letters, Marcus had been sweet and caring. In person, he sounded like he was giving orders to a servant. I need to think, she said. Think about what? We're to be married. Everything is arranged. Maybe I don't want everything arranged for me. The words surprised her as much as they surprised Marcus. Where had that come from? She'd spent her whole life letting other people make decisions for her. Her parents choosing her job. Her employer choosing her hours. Marcus choosing their future. Don't be ridiculous, Marcus said, his voice sharp with impatience. You're obviously overwrought. This wilderness, living alone with a strange man, it's affected your judgment. My judgment is fine, Magdalena said, feeling strength flow into her voice. And I haven't been living alone. I've been living with a good man who saved my life. Marcus's eyes flicked to Ezra, and his expression grew ugly. I see what's happened here. This mountain hermit has filled your head with romantic nonsense. But I know what kind of man lives alone in the wilderness. He's taken advantage of your situation, hasn't he? That's enough, Ezra said, his voice carrying a warning that made even the birds stop singing. Is it? Is it enough? Marcus turned back to Magdalena, his handsome face twisted with anger. Do you have any idea what people will say when they learn you've been living in sin with this savage? Your reputation will be ruined. No decent man will have you. I am a decent man, Ezra said quietly, and I've treated her with nothing but respect. Respect. Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. You've ruined her, whether you touched her or not. Don't you understand that, you fool? Just being here, unchaperoned, is enough to destroy her good name forever. Magdalena felt her cheeks burn with shame and anger. She'd known people might talk, but hearing Marcus say it so cruelly made her feel dirty, small, like something that had been broken and couldn't be fixed. Maybe my good name isn't worth as much as I thought, she said, surprising herself again. Don't be a fool, Magdalena. I'm offering you marriage, security, a place in decent society. What is he offering you? A life of poverty and isolation in these godforsaken mountains. The question hit harder than she expected because part of it was true. Ezra hadn't offered her anything except shelter and kindness. He'd never spoken of love or marriage or a future together. For all she knew, he was just being charitable to a woman in trouble. She looked at Ezra, hoping to see some sign of what he was thinking. But his face was closed off, unreadable as the mountains around them. I'm offering her choice, Ezra said finally. Something you don't seem to understand. Choice. Marcus's voice rose with disbelief. She made her choice when she agreed to marry me, when she took my ring and my money for traveling expenses, when she signed the marriage contract. Magdalena's hand went automatically to her left ring finger, where Marcus's engagement ring still sat. She'd forgotten about the marriage contract, the legal paper she'd signed back in Boston. Was she bound to Marcus whether she wanted to be or not? Contracts can be broken, Ezra said. Not without consequences. I've invested considerable money in this arrangement. The land, the supplies, the preparations for our wedding. If she breaks our agreement, she'll owe me every penny. The blood drained from Magdalena's face. She had no money. She'd spent everything she had on the journey west. If Marcus demanded repayment, she'd have no choice but to honor their engagement or face debtor's prison. How much? Ezra asked quietly. More than a mountain man could afford, I assure you, Marcus said with satisfaction. $300. Not counting interest and damages. $300. It might as well have been 3,000. Magdalena felt the walls closing in around her, trapping her in a future she no longer wanted. "I'll work," she said desperately. "I'll find a job somewhere and pay you back." "What job? Who would hire a woman with a ruined reputation?" "Face facts, my dear. I'm your only option." Marcus was right, and they all knew it. A woman alone in the territories, with no family and no references, would find few respectable opportunities. And with rumors about her living arrangements with Ezra, even those few doors would be closed to her. "Pack your things," Marcus said, his voice gentler now that he knew he'd won. "We'll be married as soon as we reach town. Put this whole unfortunate episode behind us." Magdalena looked around the clearing that had become more of a home to her than anywhere else she'd ever lived. The garden she'd helped restore. The cabin where she'd felt safe for the first time in years. The man who'd asked nothing of her except that she choose for herself. She pulled the engagement ring from her finger and held it out to Marcus. Her hand was shaking, but her voice was steady. "I can't marry you," she said. "I won't." Marcus stared at the ring in her palm like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life." "Maybe," she agreed, "but it's my mistake to make." The silence after Marcus rode away stretched like a held breath, and Magdalena found herself afraid to move or speak. She stood in the middle of the clearing, still holding the engagement ring, watching Ezra stack firewood with mechanical precision. He hadn't said a word since Marcus disappeared into the trees. Not when she'd refused the proposal. Not when Marcus had threatened to ruin them both. Not even when Marcus had called him names that made her face burn with anger. "Are you upset with me?" she finally asked. Ezra set down his armload of wood and looked at her with those gray eyes that seemed to see too much. "Why would I be upset? Because now you're stuck with me. Marcus was right about one thing: my reputation is ruined. No decent family will hire me as a housekeeper or teacher. I have nowhere else to go." "Is that why you think I'm helping you? Because I feel stuck with you?" His question caught her off guard. She'd been so focused on her own problems that she hadn't really thought about his reasons for anything. "I don't know," she admitted. "Why are you helping me?" Instead of answering, Ezra walked to the edge of the clearing where wildflowers grew in happy confusion. He picked a handful of purple asters and brought them back to her. "Catherine planted these the first spring we were married," he said. "I told her they were weeds, that she should pull them up and plant something useful instead. Beans or corn or something we could eat." Magdalena took the flowers, their petals soft against her fingers. "She laughed at me," Ezra continued. "Said beauty was useful too, just in a different way. Said a person needed pretty things to look at, especially when life got hard. She sounds wise. She was. She was also stubborn as a mule when she thought she was right." He smiled, and Magdalena realized it was the first real smile she'd seen from him. "After she died, I let the flowers go wild. Told myself I didn't need beauty anymore, that it was frivolous." "What changed your mind?" "You did. When you started working in the garden, bringing it back to life. When you hung those herbs to dry and made the cabin smell like home again. When you hummed while you cooked dinner." He paused, looking uncertain for the first time since she'd known him. "You reminded me that beauty isn't frivolous. It's necessary." Her heart did something complicated in her chest, but she forced herself to stay practical. "That still doesn't solve my problem. I can't stay here forever, living on your charity." "Who says it would be charity? What do you mean?" Ezra was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him struggling with words the way some people struggled with heavy loads. "I mean," he said finally, "that this place has been half dead since Catherine passed. I've been half dead too, if I'm being honest. But these past weeks, watching you bring life back to things, it's reminded me what living feels like." "Ezra, I'm not asking you to replace Catherine. Nobody could do that. But I'm asking if you might want to build something new. Something that's ours instead of mine or yours." The flowers trembled in her hands. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I'm asking if you'd consider it. I know I'm not much of a catch. I'm older than you, scarred up, not good with fancy words. I can't offer you parties or pretty dresses or life in town. But I can offer you a home where you're wanted, not just tolerated. A place where you can make choices about your own life. Magdalena looked around the clearing again, but this time she saw it differently. Not as a temporary shelter, but as a place where she could plant her own roots. Where she could decide what to grow and what to let go wild. What about love? She asked quietly. What about it? Do you love me? Could you love me? Ezra's scarred hand reached out to touch her cheek, his thumb tracing the path where tears had fallen during her hardest days. I think I already do, he said. I think I have since that first night in the cave, when you shared your last piece of bread with me even though you were starving. I didn't share bread with you. You fed me. You offered to. When I gave you that dried meat, you broke it in half and tried to give me some back. Said it wasn't right for one person to eat while another went hungry. She'd forgotten about that moment, but now she remembered the impulse to share even when she had almost nothing left. That's when I knew, Ezra continued, that you weren't just pretty or sweet or any of the things men usually notice about women. You were good. Really good. In a way that goes all the way through. I'm not that good. I was engaged to another man. I made promises to Marcus that I broke. You made promises to a man who left you alone on the prairie for 3 weeks, who cared more about his business than your safety, who talked about you like you were property he'd purchased. Ezra's voice hardened with anger. Those weren't promises worth keeping. Magdalena thought about her life in Boston, where she'd spent every day serving other people's needs, making dresses for women who looked through her like she was invisible. Living in a tiny room where nobody cared if she was happy or sad or lonely. Then she thought about the past 3 weeks. Working in the garden with dirt under her fingernails. Cooking simple meals that tasted better than any fancy dinner she'd ever eaten. Falling asleep to the sound of Ezra's quiet breathing and waking up to mountain air that made her feel alive. I need to tell you something, she said. I don't know how to be a proper frontier wife. I can't shoot a gun or preserve meat or deliver babies. I don't know anything about ranching or farming or any of the things women out here are supposed to know. Do you want to learn? Yes, more than anything. Then we'll learn together. I don't know much about gardens or cooking or making a house feel like a home. But you've been teaching me without even trying. The afternoon sun slanted through the aspen trees, turning their leaves into coins of gold. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang its liquid song. The mountains stood eternal and patient around them, as if they'd seen this scene played out 1,000 times before and knew how it should end. Marcus said people would talk, Magdalena said, about us living here together before we were married. People always talk. Question is whether you care more about what strangers think or what you know to be true. She thought about the women in Boston who'd whispered about her behind their fans. The way they'd looked at her like she was somehow less than them because she worked for wages instead of living off a husband's money. I'm tired of caring what people think, she realized. I've spent my whole life trying to be what other people wanted me to be, and where did it get me? Alone under a broken wagon, waiting for someone else to save me. You saved yourself, Ezra said. You could have given up out there, could have just laid down and waited to die. But you kept fighting. Kept hoping. That's not something anyone else can do for you. He was right. She had saved herself in the most important way. She'd chosen to get on that horse with a stranger rather than stay with what was familiar but deadly. She'd chosen to work in the garden rather than sit around feeling sorry for herself. She'd chosen to refuse Marcus rather than accept a life that would make her miserable. Yes, she said suddenly. Yes, what? Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I want to build something new. Yes, I want to stay here and learn how to be the kind of woman who can thrive in the mountains. Ezra's smile started slow and spread like sunrise across his weathered face. Are you sure? I don't want you deciding because you feel trapped or grateful or... She stood on her tiptoes and kissed him, cutting off his worried words. His lips were warm and tasted like coffee and hope. When they broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. I'm deciding because I want to, she said firmly. Because this feels like home. Because you feel like home. The gunshot cracked through the morning air like thunder, sending birds exploding from the trees in a panic of wings and frightened cries. Magdalena dropped the eggs she'd been gathering, her heart hammering as she ran toward the sound that had come from the direction of the creek. She found Ezra crouched behind a fallen log, his rifle aimed at something she couldn't see. His face was grim, focused in a way that made her stomach clench with fear. "Stay back," he said without looking at her. "Get to the cabin and bar the door." "What is it?" "3 men. Been watching the place since dawn." His voice was steady, but she could hear the tension underneath. "They're not here for a friendly visit." Magdalena's mind immediately went to Marcus. Had he come back with help to force her to honor their agreement? But when she peered carefully around the side of a tree, the men she saw were nothing like Marcus's well-dressed respectability. These were rough characters with hard faces and clothes that had seen too many campfires. Guns hung from their belts like they belonged there, and they moved with the careful watchfulness of men who lived by violence. "Who are they?" she whispered. "Trouble," Ezra said. "The kind that follows a man even when he tries to leave it behind." Before she could ask what he meant, one of the strangers called out in a voice that carried easily across the clearing. "Thornfield, we know you're out there. Come on out and let's talk like civilized folk." Ezra's jaw tightened. "Nothing civilized about you, Garrett. Now that hurts my feelings. Here I rode all this way just to catch up with an old friend." The man who spoke stepped into view, and Magdalena felt a chill run down her spine. He was tall and lean, with pale eyes that seemed to look right through things. Even from a distance, she could see the cruel smile that played around his mouth. "We ain't friends," Ezra called back. "Haven't been for 5 years. 5 years, 4 months and 16 days. Garrett corrected with mock precision. "But who's counting? Come now, Ezra. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. We just want to talk. Talk from where you are." Garrett laughed, and the sound made Magdalena's skin crawl. "Always were the suspicious type. Fine, let's talk about old times. About a certain robbery in Colorado territory. About money that was never recovered." Magdalena felt the bottom drop out of her world. Robbery? She looked at Ezra's profile, searching for some sign that this was all a mistake. But his face had gone stone cold, and she could see guilt written in every line of his body. "I don't know what you're talking about," Ezra said, but the words sounded hollow. "Sure you do. $10,000 in gold dust, stolen from a mining outfit outside Denver. You remember, it was your plan after all." "I never stole anything," Ezra said, his voice gaining strength. "That was your idea, not mine." "Maybe so, but you sure took your share quick enough. Right before you disappeared and left the rest of us to face the law." Magdalena's hands had gone numb. The man she'd agreed to marry, the man she thought was good and honest, had been part of a robbery? Had stolen money and then abandoned his partners? "I took what I was owed for the work I'd already done," Ezra said. "Legal work. I never agreed to steal anything. Legal work don't pay near as well as the other kind. And we both know you needed money fast after that fire burned up your little farm." The mention of the fire hit Ezra like a physical blow. Magdalena could see him flinch, could see old pain surface in his eyes. "I was desperate," Ezra admitted quietly. "Catherine's medical bills, rebuilding the barn, trying to save the crops. I made bad choices. You made smart choices. Right up until you got cold feet and ran off with our money." "I didn't run off with anything. I took my wages and left before things got ugly. Things got real ugly after you left. My brother Billy got shot trying to escape. Spent 2 years in prison because of your information." Garrett's voice had turned dangerous, and Magdalena could see the other 2 men moving closer to the cabin. They were being surrounded, trapped like animals in a snare. "I never gave information to anyone," Ezra said, but doubt had crept into his voice. "Someone did. Someone who knew exactly where we'd be and when. Someone who wanted to keep all the money for himself." Magdalena felt sick. Was this the man she'd fallen in love with? A thief who'd betrayed his partners and stolen their money? Had everything about him been a lie? I need you to listen to me, Ezra said suddenly, turning to look at her directly. Whatever happens, whatever you hear, remember that I never hurt anyone who didn't deserve it. And I never lied to you about the important things. The important things? She whispered. You were part of a robbery. I was part of a lot of things I'm not proud of. But I never stole from innocent people. And I never killed anyone. That's debatable, Garrett called out, apparently able to hear their conversation. What about Jimmy Morrison? Remember him? Young fellow, couldn't have been more than 19. Ezra's face went white. Jimmy died in an accident. Accident, was it? Mighty convenient accident. Happening right after he threatened to go to the law about our little business arrangement. Stop, Magdalena said, unable to listen anymore. Just stop. But Garrett wasn't finished. And what about your wife, Ezra? Catherine, wasn't it? Heard she died in a fire. Mighty strange how fires seem to follow you around. The words hit Ezra like bullets. He stood up slowly, his rifle still trained on the trees where the men were hiding. Leave her out of this, he said, his voice deadly quiet. Hard to leave her out when she's right at the center of it. See, we did some checking after you disappeared. Found out about that insurance money you collected after the fire. Enough to pay off all your debts and then some. The insurance barely covered the funeral, Ezra said. Maybe. Or maybe you needed that money gone, so you wouldn't look suspicious when you suddenly had gold to spend. Magdalena felt like she was drowning in revelations. Insurance money? Had Ezra somehow caused the fire that killed his wife? Had everything he'd told her been lies built on top of more lies? I loved Catherine more than my own life, Ezra said, his voice breaking. I would never have hurt her. Love makes men do strange things, like burn down their own property for insurance money, like arrange accidents for people who ask too many questions. That's enough, Ezra roared, standing fully upright. I'm done listening to your poison. He fired a shot over the men's heads, the sound echoing off the mountains like an avalanche of noise. Magdalena screamed and ducked down, her ears ringing. Next one won't be a warning, Ezra called out. Easy there, old friend, Garrett said, but his voice had lost its mocking tone. No need for violence. We just want what's ours. The location of that gold you hid before you ran off. I don't have any gold. Your cabin says different. Nice place, well stocked, good tools. Takes money to set up this kind of operation. I worked for every dollar I spent on this place. Sure you did. Just like you worked for every dollar in that mining robbery. Magdalena looked at the cabin she'd come to think of as home, seeing it with new eyes. Had it all been built with stolen money? Had she been living in luxury paid for by crime? Time's up, Ezra, Garrett called. Either you tell us where the gold is, or we start looking for it ourselves. And we might not be too careful about what gets broken in the process. The threat was clear. They would tear the place apart, and probably hurt anyone who got in their way. Magdalena thought about the gentleman who'd saved her life, who'd offered her a home and asked for nothing in return. Could that same man really be a thief and possibly worse? Give me 1 minute, Ezra said. Let me think. He turned to Magdalena, his eyes full of pain and something that looked like goodbye. I need you to know, he said quietly, that every word I said about loving you was true. Everything else, everything about my past, I should have told you before. But I was afraid you'd look at me the way you're looking at me now. She realized she was staring at him with horror and confusion, and she tried to change her expression. But the damage was done. Are you what they say you are? She asked. I don't know anymore, he admitted. I thought I was a good man who'd made some bad choices. But maybe I've been lying to myself all along. The standoff stretched like a bowstring ready to snap, and Magdalena found herself pressed against the cold stone of the cabin wall, listening to her own heartbeat thunder in her ears. Through the window, she could see Ezra still crouched behind the fallen log, his rifle steady despite the tremor she'd noticed in his hands. Time's up, Thornfield. Garrett's voice cut through the mountain air like a blade. My patience ain't what it used to be. Then maybe you should work on that, Ezra called back, but Magdalena could hear the exhaustion in his voice. Whatever strength had carried him through the first part of this confrontation was starting to fade. She closed her eyes and tried to think. 3 armed men against one, with her caught in the middle like a prize they might fight over. The nearest neighbor was 2 days' ride away, and even if someone heard the gunshots, they'd probably assume it was just hunting. A soft scratching sound made her open her eyes. Someone was at the back door of the cabin, working at the latch with careful fingers. Her breath stopped in her throat as she realized Garrett's men had split up, trying to get inside while Ezra was distracted. Moving as quietly as she could, Magdalena grabbed the heavy iron skillet from the stove. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was better than nothing. She positioned herself beside the door and waited. The latch lifted with a tiny click. The door swung open slowly, and a man's boot appeared on the threshold. Magdalena raised the skillet and brought it down as hard as she could on the back of his head. The man dropped like a sack of grain, his gun clattering across the floor. But the noise brought shouts from outside, and she realized her small victory might have made things worse. "They got inside!" one of the men yelled. "Tommy's down!" Gunfire erupted from multiple directions. Magdalena threw herself flat on the floor as bullets punched through the cabin walls, sending splinters of wood flying like angry hornets. The carefully arranged home she'd grown to love was being torn apart around her. "Magdalena!" Ezra's voice rose above the chaos. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," she called back, though she wasn't sure that was true. Her hands were shaking so hard she could barely hold onto the skillet. The unconscious man groaned and started to stir. Without thinking, Magdalena hit him again with the pan, harder this time. He went limp, and she felt a sick satisfaction that scared her almost as much as the bullets. "Listen to me," Ezra shouted to the men outside. "You want the gold? Fine, I'll tell you where it is. But leave the woman alone." "Smart thinking," Garrett replied. "But first, let's make sure you're being honest." More shots rang out, but these seemed to be aimed at the cabin walls rather than at Ezra. They were trying to flush him out, force him to give up his defensive position. Magdalena crawled to the front window and peered out carefully. She could see one of the attackers moving through the trees, trying to get behind Ezra's position. In a few minutes, they'd have him surrounded completely. She had to do something. The unconscious man's rifle lay where he'd dropped it. Magdalena had never fired a gun in her life, but she'd watched Ezra cleaning his weapons and knew the basics. Point, aim, pull the trigger. How hard could it be? The rifle was heavier than she'd expected, and her hands were still shaking. But anger was starting to burn through her fear. These men had invaded her home, threatened the man she loved, and turned her peaceful morning into a nightmare. She forced herself to think about what Ezra had taught her during their quiet evenings together. Breathe slowly. Line up the sights. Don't jerk the trigger. The man in the trees was almost in position to shoot Ezra in the back. Magdalena took a deep breath, aimed for a spot just ahead of where he was walking, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked like an angry horse, slamming into her shoulder hard enough to bring tears to her eyes. But her shot had found its mark, not the man himself, but the tree branch directly above his head. The heavy limb crashed down, pinning him to the ground with a scream of pain and surprise. "Nice shot," Ezra called out, and she could hear genuine admiration in his voice. But Garrett wasn't impressed. "That does it. Billy, burn them out." The smell of smoke reached Magdalena's nose before she saw the flames. They were setting fire to the cabin, just like they probably had to Ezra's first home. Just like they might have done to Catherine. Terror clawed at her throat as she realized they were trapped. The back door was blocked by the unconscious man, and the front door would put her directly in the line of fire. The windows were too small to climb through quickly. Smoke was beginning to fill the cabin, making her eyes water and her lungs burn. She could hear the flames crackling as they ate through the dry wood of the walls. "Ezra!" she screamed. "They're burning the cabin." "I know. Stay low and keep breathing." But staying low wasn't going to save her if the whole building went up in flames. She looked around desperately for another way out, her eyes falling on the trapdoor that led to the root cellar. Ezra had shown it to her weeks ago, explaining how it connected to a natural cave system that extended back into the mountain. The unconscious man was starting to wake up again, blinking groggily as smoke swirled around him. Magdalena hit him once more with the skillet, then grabbed his legs and dragged him away from the trapdoor. The cellar was dark and cool, a sharp contrast to the growing heat above. She could hear the fire spreading overhead, eating through everything she'd come to love about this place. But there was no time for grief. The cave system extended farther back than she'd expected, with narrow passages that twisted and turned through the mountain. Some were too small for a grown person, but others were wide enough to walk upright. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, she saw light ahead. Natural light, not the orange glow of fire. She emerged from a crack in the rocks about 50 yards from the cabin, completely behind the position where Garrett and his men were hiding. The scene that greeted her was worse than she'd feared. The cabin was fully engulfed now, flames reaching toward the sky like grasping fingers. Ezra was pinned down behind his log, unable to move without exposing himself to gunfire. But now she was behind the attackers and she still had the rifle. Magdalena had never wanted to hurt another human being in her life. But as she watched these men try to burn alive the person she loved most in the world, something hard and cold settled in her chest. "Let him go," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. Garrett spun around, his eyes widening as he saw her standing there with the rifle aimed at his chest. "Well, well," he said, but his cocky smile looked forced now. "Looks like the little lady has some fight in her after all. I said let him go." "Can't do that, darling. Too much history between old Ezra and me." "Then you're going to have some history with me too." She pulled the trigger. The shot took Garrett in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his gun flying. He hit the ground hard, clutching the wound and cursing in language that would have made her mother faint. The remaining man, Billy, she thought, threw down his weapon and raised his hands. "Don't shoot," he pleaded. "I surrender." Ezra emerged from behind his cover, moving carefully but quickly. In minutes, he had Billy tied up and Garrett's wound bandaged well enough to keep him from bleeding to death. The cabin was a total loss, nothing but charred timbers and smoking ash. Everything they'd built together was gone, but they were alive and somehow that felt like enough. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Ezra asked, pulling her into his arms. "I had a good teacher," she said, breathing in the scent of him, smoke and sweat and something that was purely Ezra. "He taught me that sometimes you have to fight for what matters." "And what matters to you?" She looked at the ruins of their home, then back at his scarred, worried face. "You," she said simply. "This life we're building. The truth, whatever it is. Even if the truth is ugly? Especially then. I'm done with pretty lies, Ezra. I want real, even if real is hard." He kissed her then, fierce and desperate and full of promise. Around them, the mountains stood witness to their choice. Not the safe option, not the easy option, but the true one. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The sheriff arrived 3 days after the fire, his badge glinting in the morning sun, as he surveyed the blackened ruins of what had once been Magdalena's home. She watched from her perch on a fallen log, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had grown cold, while she stared at the man who would decide their fate. "Name's Sheriff Morrison," he said, dismounting from a tired-looking bay horse. "Got word there was some trouble up here." Magdalena's blood turned to ice water. Morrison. The same name Garrett had mentioned during the shootout. Jimmy Morrison, the young man who'd supposedly died in an accident connected to Ezra's past. Ezra stepped forward, his hands visible and empty. "Sheriff, I'm Ezra Thornfield. These are my prisoners." He gestured toward Garrett and Billy, who sat tied to a tree with bandages covering their wounds. Both men had been sullen and quiet since the fight, but now Garrett's eyes lit up with malicious hope. "Well, well," Garrett said, grinning despite his injured shoulder. "Sheriff Morrison. Any relation to Jimmy Morrison, by chance?" The sheriff's face went hard as granite. "Jimmy was my son." Magdalena felt her heart sink into her stomach. Of all the lawmen in the territory, they'd gotten the one person who had every reason to hate Ezra. The one person who would never listen to their side of the story. Thought so, Garrett continued, his voice dripping with false sympathy. Terrible shame. What happened to that boy? Cut down in his prime by a man who was supposed to be his friend. Shut your mouth, Ezra said quietly, but there was pain in his voice that hadn't been there before. Sheriff Morrison studied Ezra with eyes that held 20 years of grief and anger. You're the one who was there when Jimmy died. Yes, sir. The one who said it was an accident. It was an accident. That's not what these men told the territorial marshal last week. They said you pushed Jimmy off that cliff because he was going to expose your robbery plans. Magdalena stood up slowly, her legs feeling weak. The whole thing was a trap. Garrett and his men hadn't just come for revenge or money. They'd come to destroy Ezra completely. And they'd brought the one person who would be guaranteed to believe their lies. Sheriff, she said, stepping forward. I don't know what happened in the past, but I know what happened here. These men burned down our home and tried to kill us. Morrison's gaze shifted to her, taking in her simple dress and sun-darkened hands. And you are? Magdalena rose. I'm Ezra's fiancé. Fiancé? Garrett laughed harshly. That's rich. Tell him how long you've known this murderer, darling. Tell him about your first husband-to-be, the one you abandoned to take up with a criminal. Heat flooded Magdalena's cheeks, but she forced herself to meet the sheriff's questioning stare. I've known Ezra for 2 months. He saved my life when my wagon broke down on the prairie. 2 months, Morrison repeated slowly. And in that time, did he ever mention Jimmy Morrison? No, sir. But he mentioned losing people he cared about. He mentioned making mistakes he regretted. I bet he did. Regret comes easy when you're looking at a rope. Billy, who had been quiet until now, suddenly spoke up. Sheriff, there's something you should know. We found something when we were searching the area. He nodded toward his saddlebags, which were lying near the dead fire. Go ahead and look. Third pouch from the left. Morrison walked over and opened the indicated pouch. When he straightened up, he was holding a small leather bag that clinked with the sound of metal on metal. Gold dust, he said, looking directly at Ezra. Quite a bit of it. That's not mine, Ezra said, but his voice lacked conviction. Course it is, Garrett said. We planted it there ourselves right after we arrived. Been waiting 5 years to get this evidence back. Magdalena felt the world spinning around her. Evidence that had been planted, but how could they prove it? How could they prove anything when everyone seemed determined to believe the worst about Ezra? Sheriff Morrison, she said desperately. Your son was 19 when he died? That's right. What was he like? Was he the kind of person who would get involved with criminals? Morrison's face softened slightly. Jimmy was naive, trusting. He always saw the best in people, even when he shouldn't have. Then maybe he saw something good in Ezra too. Maybe there's more to this story than what these men are telling you. Maybe there is, Morrison agreed. That's why we're going to sort this out properly. In town with a judge and jury. He pulled a set of shackles from his saddlebags and approached Ezra. Ezra Thornfield, you're under arrest for the murder of Jimmy Morrison and the robbery of the Sunset Mining Company. No! Magdalena stepped between them. You can't just take their word for it. These men burned down our home. After he shot at us, Billy protested. We came here peaceful like, just wanting to talk. They were going to kill us, Magdalena insisted. That's not how they tell it, Morrison said. And right now it's 3 witnesses against 2. Not good odds. As the sheriff locked the shackles around Ezra's wrists, Magdalena felt something break inside her chest. This couldn't be happening. Not when they'd finally found each other. Not when they'd finally found home. How long? She asked. How long before the trial? Month, maybe 2. Depends on when the circuit judge comes through. What am I supposed to do until then? Morrison looked around at the burned cabin, the scattered remains of their life together. I'd suggest you go back to wherever you came from, Mississippi. This mountain's no place for a woman alone. This mountain is my home. Not anymore it isn't. But as the sheriff prepared to leave with his prisoners, Billy whispered something that made Morrison pause. Magdalena couldn't hear the words, but she saw the sheriff's expression change from grim determination to something that looked almost like doubt. "What did he say?" she demanded. Morrison studied her face for a long moment. "He said there's something else I should know about you, Miss Rose. Something about your reputation and your living arrangements." The implication hit her like a slap. Even if Ezra was cleared of the murder charges, her own reputation would be ruined. No decent family would associate with a woman who'd lived alone with a man, unmarried. No church would welcome her. No employer would hire her. "Sheriff," Ezra said quietly, "whatever happens to me, Miss Rose is innocent of any wrongdoing. She deserves better than this." "Maybe she does," Morrison agreed. "But she should have thought of that before she took up with you." As they rode away, Ezra twisted in his saddle to look back at her one last time. Magdalena raised her hand in a small wave, trying to smile so the last thing he saw wouldn't be her tears. But the moment they disappeared into the trees, she sank to her knees in the ashes of her burned home and sobbed until no more tears would come. When the crying was done, she wiped her face and stood up slowly. The mountains still surrounded her, beautiful and indifferent. The stream still bubbled over its rocks. The aspens still whispered secrets in the wind. And somewhere in this wilderness, there had to be a way to save the man she loved. Winter was coming early to the Black Hills, and Magdalena could feel it in her bones as she rode down the muddy main street of Deadwood. 6 weeks had passed since they'd taken Ezra away, and the trial was set to begin tomorrow morning. She'd spent those weeks learning things no lady was supposed to know. How to track men through the wilderness. How to ask questions in saloons where decent women never went. How to trade favors and information with people who lived outside the law. Most importantly, she'd learned that truth was often buried under layers of lies, and sometimes you had to dig through a lot of dirt to find it. The boarding house where she'd rented a room was full of minors and gamblers, men who looked at her with curiosity and speculation. She kept her head down and spoke to no one, but her ears were always open. That's how she'd learned about the real Jimmy Morrison. The boy had been everything his father said, trusting, naive, eager to see good in everyone. But he'd also been desperate for money to pay off gambling debts that would have gotten him killed if he hadn't settled them quickly. That desperation had made him easy prey for men like Garrett, who'd convinced him that robbing the mining company was practically a public service. After all, the mine owners were getting rich while their workers barely scraped by. Jimmy had recruited Ezra because he needed someone who knew about explosives, someone who could blow open the company safe without bringing down the whole building. What Jimmy hadn't told Ezra was that the job involved more than just taking money from a faceless corporation. Magdalena had learned all this from a broken-down old prospector named Pete, who'd been Jimmy's drinking partner in the weeks before he died. Pete had been too drunk to be useful to the law 5 years ago, but he remembered everything with the clarity that sometimes comes to men who've lost everything else. According to Pete, Jimmy had been planning to double-cross his partners from the beginning. He was going to take all the money and run, leaving Ezra and the others to face the consequences. But Ezra had figured out the plan and confronted Jimmy the night before the robbery. They went up to Eagles Point to hash it out. Pete had told her over a bottle of Rotgut whiskey. Jimmy was drunk as a skunk, waving his gun around, threatening to shoot Ezra if he didn't go along with the plan. Ezra was trying to talk sense into him, but Jimmy kept backing up, getting closer to the edge. What happened then? Jimmy stumbled. Simple as that. Drunk fool backed right off the cliff, gun still in his hand. Ezra tried to grab him, but it was too late. The story matched what Ezra had told the authorities 5 years ago, but nobody had believed him then. Why would they believe him now? That's where Magdalena's other discovery came in. She'd spent 2 weeks tracking down Billy's ex-wife, a bitter woman named Sarah who lived in a shack outside of town. Sarah had plenty to say about her former husband's criminal activities, including his habit of planting evidence to frame innocent people. Billy's got a whole collection of little bags and trinkets, Sarah had explained. Keeps them in a box under his bed. Says you never know when you might need to make someone look guilty of something. The gold dust they'd found in Billy's saddlebags hadn't come from any robbery. It had come from Billy's evidence collection, planted specifically to make Ezra look guilty. Sarah had even given Magdalena a letter Billy had written, bragging about the frame-up to his brother in California. It wasn't much, but it was something. Now, as Magdalena sat in the courthouse waiting for the trial to begin, she clutched that letter like a lifeline. Around her, the townspeople whispered and pointed. Word had spread about the mountain hermit accused of murder, and about the woman who'd thrown away her reputation to defend him. Sheriff Morrison entered the courtroom, his face as grim as ever. Behind him came Garrett, his arm still in a sling, looking confident and pleased with himself. Billy followed, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Finally, they brought in Ezra. 6 weeks in jail had changed him. He was thinner, paler, with new lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and endless worry. But when his gaze found hers across the crowded courtroom, his face lit up with a smile that made her heart skip. The judge was an elderly man with kind eyes and a reputation for fairness. He listened patiently as the prosecutor laid out the case against Ezra, the witness testimony, the planted evidence, the motive of greed and desperation. Then it was time for Ezra's defense. The lawyer they'd found was young and inexperienced, clearly overwhelmed by the complexity of the case. He stumbled through his opening statement, failed to object to several pieces of questionable evidence, and generally made Magdalena want to stand up and defend Ezra herself. Which, as it turned out, was exactly what she was going to have to do. During the lunch recess, she cornered the lawyer in the hallway. "You're going to lose," she told him bluntly. "Miss Rose, I appreciate your concern, but no buts. You're going to lose because you don't understand what really happened. But I do." She told him everything she'd learned about Jimmy's gambling debts, about Billy's evidence collection, about the real events at Eagles Point. The lawyer listened with growing amazement. "This is incredible," he said. "But why didn't you come forward with this information sooner?" "Because I needed proof. And because I needed to make sure I could present it in a way that people would believe." "Do you have proof?" She handed him Sarah's letter and Pete's written statement. "Not enough to prove innocence, but enough to create reasonable doubt. Miss Rose, you realize that if you testify, the prosecution will tear apart your character. They'll make you out to be a fallen woman who would say anything to save her lover. Let them try." When court resumed, Magdalena took the witness stand with her head held high. The prosecutor did exactly what the defense lawyer had predicted, questioning her morals, her motives, her sanity. But she answered every question with calm dignity, never losing her temper, never backing down from the truth. "Miss Rose," the prosecutor said, "isn't it true that you're so desperate to save this man that you would lie under oath?" "No, sir. I'm so desperate to save him that I spent 6 weeks learning the truth. And the truth is that Ezra Thornfield is a good man who made some bad choices, but he never murdered anyone." "And how can you be so certain?" "Because I know what kind of man he is. He saved my life when he could have ridden past. He gave me shelter when he could have left me to die. He offered me a home when he could have turned me away. A murderer doesn't do those things. A murderer might do exactly those things to hide his true nature." Magdalena looked directly at the jury, 12 men who would decide Ezra's fate. "A murderer might," she agreed. "But love doesn't lie, and I love Ezra Thornfield not because of what he's done, but because of who he is, who he's always been, even when he lost his way." The courtroom was silent as she stepped down from the witness stand. She'd said everything she could say, presented every piece of evidence she could find. Now all they could do was wait for 12 strangers to decide whether love was enough to overcome doubt. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. When they returned, their faces were grave but not unsympathetic. "We find the defendant not guilty of murder," the foreman announced. The courtroom erupted in noise, some cheering, some protesting, all chaos. But Magdalena heard none of it. She only had eyes for Ezra, who was staring at her with wonder and gratitude and something that looked very much like forever. As the shackles were removed from his wrists, He walked straight to her and pulled her into his arms. "How?" he whispered against her hair. "Same way you saved me," she said. "One choice at a time." They were married that afternoon by the same judge who had declared Ezra innocent. It wasn't the wedding either of them had imagined. No white dress, no church, no family to witness their vows. But as they stood together in the courthouse, surrounded by strangers and speaking words of love and commitment, Magdalena knew she'd found something more valuable than any fairy tale ending. She'd found a man worth fighting for, and discovered she was a woman worth fighting with. The mountains were waiting for them when they rode home, patient and eternal. There would be a new cabin to build, a new life to create from the ashes of the old. But they would build it together, brick by brick, choice by choice, until they had something that couldn't be burned down or stolen or destroyed by the doubts of others. They would build a home,